Welcome to the B2B Category Creators Podcast, hosted by Gil Alouche, founder and CEO of Metadata.io. This podcast is all about sharing the real and sometimes uncomfortable secrets of category creation in the B2B software space. On this week's episode, we have Macario Namie, CMO of ASAPP, an AI solution for customer experience performance, and Bryan Goodwin, co-founder, president, and CRO at TorchPro, a sports media company changing the way world-class athletes and fans interact digitally.
Happy Friday, everyone. My name is Gil Alouche. I'm the founder and CEO of Metadata. This is the some number of the Category Creator podcast episode. I'm really excited to have Bryan and Macario here as guests for the podcast. Bryan, let's start with you. Maybe you can do a quick introduction on yourself and the company you work for.
Yeah, Gil, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. So Bryan Goodwin, co-founder and president of TorchPro.com. We're a sports media company changing the way that athletes, fans, and brands interact. Before TorchPro, I spent 15 years between two early stage startups, Flipkey.com and then Drizzly.com, which I'm sure we'll dive into at some point along the way. So again, thanks for having me and excited to be here.
Big fan of Drizzly. Macario, you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Gil, and nice to meet you, Bryan, as well. Macario Namie, I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of ASAPP. What we do is we bring machine learning and artificial intelligence to contact centers to make the human agent significantly more productive. So trying to replicate how agents make decisions in serving customers and trying to help every other agent be as equally good as the very best agent in the organization. My own background, I spent 20 plus more years in enterprise software, mostly in startups, including a company called Jasper. I was very focused on the Internet of Things. I've been part of Cisco, early person at WebEx, way back in the day. And so lots of fantastic experiences and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. And Bryan, I know you're in North Carolina, half an hour from Charlotte. Macario, where are you located?
So I'm based in San Francisco, but I'm actually spending the month out here in the summer in San Diego. So this is a replication of some of the view that I have outside my window.
Nice. Very cool. Awesome. So we always start with a cheer. Hopefully in the next 48 minutes, we will finish at least 2 drinks. Cheers and happy Friday. Thank you for joining. Cool. Well, in this podcast, we like to spend some time on category creation, sometimes trying to break tech companies' absolute bullshits that are not true, that we know not to be the real life story, and then also talk about some absolute truths that you did learn in your experience. So let's start with category creation because that's the name of the podcast. Macario, maybe you can start us off. When you hear that tagline, that name, category creation, what comes to mind right away?
So the thing that I think about the most when people say category creation is not everybody can own a category. Not everything deserves its own unique category. And that is a marketer's dream. To be able to say we are the category king, right? But the truth is there's a lot more marketing attempts that simply just shouldn't be. And it's perfectly fine to go into existing categories, own them, dominate, redefine them, and you can make a lot of money, build a highly successful business. So I think sometimes we get a little overexcited about thinking we can all create our own unique category.
Love that. Definitely heard that before. Thank you. That's cool. And I also agree to that. Bryan, what about you? When you hear category creation, what comes to mind?
And for me, it's sort of education, right? Like Flipkey didn't define the travel category, but vacation rentals were a part of that category that were very underutilized. And I think 15 years later, it's hard to imagine even the world where vacation rentals weren't as prevalent and prominent as they are today. But when we were out there evangelizing that vacation rentals were going to be a thing, property management companies were telling us they're going to still use their catalogs. And travelers on the other side didn't even know that you could rent a house. You can rent a whole house. And so same sort of with Drizzly, right? Buying alcohol is not a new category, but buying it on your smartphone and having it delivered is sort of a new way to look at an older category. And so I think of education as that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Changing behavior, which is, I think, an extremely hard thing to do.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
That's cool. I was just talking to a friend of mine who created the first blockchain technology for NFTs before NFTs was a thing. And guess what? He did not win the market. The last company, like from a year ago, that came up with it. And I was just telling him, like, Trent, shit, like you came up with it like a long time ago. I was like, yeah, too early. And I think many times, to your point, this is the situation, and maybe you have to educate or just wait patiently to survive until the market agrees with you. Macario, when you say it's not always like, yeah, maybe CMOs always want to do it, but it's not always the case that you need to create a category. How do you decide? Like, what's the one question you ask yourself to determine? Like, let's say you just joined a new startup or whatever, an existing company, and you have to determine. CEO asks, "We need to create a category," and you say yes or no, and this is why, because I asked that question.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think the criteria is really trying to understand why you think you need to be able to create a category. And sometimes if we think about, well, we want to because it's good for us, it generally doesn't mean you should do it. And a lot of times that's kind of where the enthusiasm lies, or the justification is. It's really more of just like a marketing strategy or a way to promote yourself better, or to be able to change the criteria used in the buying decision. But the truth is, if you look at the landscape of existing categories, there may be some that are just so old that are just simply ripe for disruption. And it's a wonderful place to go in and sort of redefine what that is. The vacation rental one is a perfect example, right? That you didn't need to create a new category, but they completely redominated and redefined what vacation rentals should be. So it's really looking at what is the lens from the buyer point of view or the consumer point of view. And can you educate them enough to say, the way you've been thinking about this, think about it a different way. You should do it. It can be done a totally different way. Or are you truly creating something that they never really thought about before, or there's some unique problem that hadn't really ever been solved? And I think that's really what we're trying to decide, is look at it from the buyer's perspective. And do you really need to create something new or redefine an existing one? That to me is probably the first question I would ask ourselves.
And how do you separate between what you want and what the customer wants? Because you have a company, it's a for-profit company. If you think it's going to make it easier to make more money faster by redefining the buying criteria, like you mentioned accurately before, how do you separate that from what you want and what you think you need to do to make the biggest company, the unicorn $1 billion outcome, from actually understanding what the customer wants and how they think about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it also think about the constituent that you're also marketing to, or that you're trying to sell to. So Salesforce is a good example. They're a good example for many things associated with category creation, right? And very cliche, but in those very early days, Benioff would talk about, SaaS, and he would be promoting SaaS, and he would say, we're about the enablement of, or the end of software. But the people selling, the people who were actually working the phones, were not saying, hey, would you like to buy the end of software? They were selling, you have a contact manager, let me replace your contact manager. They sold to an existing category and a very well-known and understood product. And so, for Benioff, thinking about the media, the press, the analyst community, the investor community is going to be different than the people that are actually the buyers. And so he wasn't trying to create a category for the individual sales manager managing 5 or 6 reps. Those people were just trying to sell exactly what they already know and solve a very specific problem. And but he did it in sort of a roundabout way, which I think is actually quite beautiful. Yeah.
Interesting. I wonder what Mark Benioff would say to that.
Brian, yeah, I'm curious.
I am curious too. Maybe one day I'll have him here. Brian, when you think about educating the market, how do you decide whether the market should be educated at the right time, or just go and ride an existing wave?
Yeah, I mean, you can only try so hard to educate the market. Use the Drizzly example. We pounded the drum for a long time that alcohol delivery was a better way. And we often talked about time, the time that you saved, maybe the ability to shop more products. But for a lot of people, going to the store wasn't broken. It worked. And so then the pandemic comes along, right? And it forces a shift in the way that they perceive their daily activities. They're forced to then try something that we told them was a better way, or we thought it was a better way. And then through trying it and experiencing it and realizing, okay, this does save me some time, or maybe this gives me more selection or better price, they then change their behavior that way. So I think you have to educate both sides of the market. I think for us at Drizzly too, we were also responsible for educating the retailer side of the marketplace, right? Because without our retail partners and working with them to enable the technology so that consumers could buy, that infrastructure and marketplace never would have set up. So we had to educate both sides. And the retailer conversation is very different. Hey, the future of the way people purchase alcohol is going to be digital. Well, there's a lot of local retailers that's a hard thing to understand, but then you start to get them, and it's the marriage of all of those things. So I think you have to educate, but I think you said it earlier, Gil, like timing matters. And sometimes you can't dictate the timing, and surviving long enough to match up with the timing is a key skill, if it's a skill.
Very interesting. Two follow-up questions. One, did 2020 change the world for I mean, change the world for sure, but for Drizzly, did that make a category creation and making that case that everyone is going to buy online and save a lot of time? Did it make that change? Was that kind of a critical change?
Absolutely. I mean, on the consumer side in particular, because, and again, oftentimes people would say, well, you got lucky. You hate to look at the pandemic and think anybody benefited from it because it was a terrible time. But the reality was that we had 4,000 retail liquor stores in place at the time when consumers needed it. And so that infrastructure that took 7 years to build was able to withstand all the demand that was immediately coming. You remember, I mean, it wasn't so long ago, and it's easy to forget. And I think sometimes people shut it out, but remember, you couldn't leave, like shelter in place, you couldn't leave your house. And then liquor stores in many communities were deemed essential businesses. So they were able to only do delivery. And so then all of a sudden, with no other option, imagine if we didn't have the technology built, or imagine if we decided that day that this was something that we wanted to do, we could have never done it because it took 7 years to get there. So it was a huge tipping point on the consumer behavior change, I would say, without a doubt. Inflection point. And then all these people realized that, this is pretty good. This is pretty easy. I think grocery delivery was very similar. I think there was a lot of those businesses where education changed fast.
Interesting. I didn't even realize. I have been a customer of Drizzly for years. I think since you guys.
You're what we would consider an early adopter.
Yeah, I got my first crown early ago, but that's cool. That's interesting to hear. And you're talking about retailers. Did retailers, and that's an interesting subject in general, did retailers, especially because you have this two-sided marketplace, did retailers find you competition at any point? Did they consider you a competition?
Certainly. I think one of the most interesting historical evolutions of Drizzly was when we started, every retailer sort of had their own exclusive territory, right? We would say, this is your store in the North End, and then we're going to put one in South Boston, and those zones aren't going to overlap. And then as demand started to increase, we realized retailer capacity was a gating item. If a retailer only had 2 drivers and they got 10 orders, there was a capacity issue. And so our solve to that was to allow multiple stores to cover the same area. Well, that didn't make the retailers that originally had the exclusive territory very happy. But then again, going back, and the evolution of all of that was, well, hey, why would a consumer choose to buy from you if they had 2 options? Based on your service, just like anything else. What's your selection? What's your inventory look like? How quickly do you deliver your product, and how friendly are your drivers? Those are the things that are going to win in the real world. This is just the new real world. And so I think they all evolved. They evolved much more rapidly than you would have expected. So yes, I think they looked at us as potentially competition. They looked at the way our environment had them competing with their other retailers. But at the end of the day, we were building technology that they alone could have never built, right? And so they realized that without plugging into our infrastructure, they couldn't have done delivery at all. And so we were enabling and empowering them to do it. And then the cream rose to the top. Oftentimes, the best offline retailers were the best online retailers because it was their business that, it was their people and their business that was successful, not how they were doing it.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
I had a similar model, a startup that I worked for 11 years called Jasper. And this is one where I was able to actually create a category, and I was very fortunate. It was a connectivity service platforms. And eventually we basically turned it into an IoT platform as that phrase sort of started to come to pass. But we actually sat in between the telecommunication providers, so think AT&T, and the enterprises who were embedding connectivity in their things. So if you were, General Motors and you have a OnStar service, then you're basically using our software to control your AT&T connection, your AT&T SIM cards and access on the network. And there's a very delicate balance between they were the ones who were actually supplying, but we were actually the enabling technology that allowed these two parties to come together and both get their needs met. In the case of General Motors, they have very different needs than what a cell phone user would be in terms of what they need off of the network, especially when there's nobody holding the phone or the SIM card. And on the AT&T side, all of their billing infrastructure and all of their systems are not designed for cars, right? Or for things that are being charged pennies or nickels versus the $30, $40, $60. And it was one of the things that it was a constant struggle because we were the key focal point that made a lot of that possible for the enterprises, the General Motors of the time. But the suppliers, the telcos, really wanted to control the whole relationship. And it was a constant friction to sort of make that work. And it sounds a little similar, probably not quite as much friction, but at some point, who has the bigger brand, who has the one who has a higher degree of influence on the buyer, and that created a lot of heartache for us as we sat in between these two behemoth kind of companies, right?
Very interesting. Were you able to solve it? Like, were you able to eventually bring that innovation and still figure out a way for both business models to work?
So we got the business model to work, and we eventually sold to Cisco, who actually has a lot more capabilities. And so we sold to them in 2016 for about $1.5 billion. And so it was a wonderful exit all around. But I will say, when you have the supplier on the other end, they limited our ambition. And so that one thing was very, very tough. There were some things we wanted to do, and they said, no, we don't want you to do that. And because they held that supply, they basically had a chokehold, right? And we really had our ambition contained. So that was kind of the downside in our world to sort of that two-sided business model, is we had suppliers who were very, very powerful and were really critical to our success. But as a result, we were basically capped, because at some point they said, we don't want you to do these things. We want to do it ourselves. We want you out of the picture, those kinds of things, which is really tough. It was very tough.
I want to switch gears to like a different subject. I want to ask one follow-up question. It sounds like both of you are, you had a two-sided marketplace. You essentially had existing players in the space you were working in, but and you kind of had to convince everyone in the space that a new way is the right way to go. And then some people had less power, some people had more power. How do you manage that to bring that innovation? If you had to, if you go back and you're thinking, okay, there was one thing we did that, whether it was creating a new category or reinventing the category, or redesigning it, was there one thing that you did that got people, both sides, even if they had a little bit of conflicting interest in mind? What was the one thing that you did that got people to say, yeah, this is the future, we're willing to walk towards it? Maybe not full speed ahead, but we'll walk towards it. What is that thing? Macario, maybe we can start with you.
For us, we had to solve a problem that neither side actually was able to solve on their own. And that was sort of our, outside of, good technology, good features, et cetera, that was the one sort of piece of magic that was really unique to us. The aggregation of thing producers, right, whether it be cars or thermostats or whatever it may be, didn't have the ability to go change the infrastructure that is used by the AT&Ts of the world for the way that they provision or build services. They just have no influence on that whatsoever. And inside of these telecommunication providers, they had no ability to go serve these enterprises on a global basis in these multiple different countries for a product that is basically nickels and dimes compared to tens and twenties. And so we solved something that neither party could actually solve on their own. And that's really where we carved out a really unique space for us.
I see. Okay, so creating that thing that none of them could do before, so they really needed you. Is it the same for you, Brian? I think I heard a little bit of that, but I'll let you answer for your own.
Yeah, it's definitely a piece of it. It's an interesting and a good question. I think one of the things, if I think about one thing, it was kind of like brutal honesty with empathy. But like, I kind of always got the sense that this is where the ball is kind of going, right? This is where things are heading. And, you know, as someone who just turned 40, who graduated around the time when Facebook was coming, just digital, right? And the internet and the evolution of the internet, it's sort of like, you know, my father's generation, I don't think saw it as clearly and obviously as maybe our generation did. And then I think the next generation that's coming behind us is going to see a whole bunch of stuff that we don't see coming at all, right? So it was sort of like, we used to use this like, and again, in an empathetic way, but it was sort of the ostrich with the head in the sand analogy. Like, do you want to pick your head up one day? And a lot of these are small business owners. Do you want to pick your head up one day and be out of business? So like, what's the worst thing that can happen? You can try it and maybe it's not for you, or we're not the right partner. But worse than that is pretending like this isn't happening and doing nothing about it. And that was the thing that resonated the most with partners on all sides.
Interesting. I think many technology companies, I think, battle with this. You know, they have this struggle of the, maybe not even the legacy players, but just like the old way of doing things. There are some who are considered, you know, good players, and they prefer to not hear about it. What was it, Blockbuster, that said that Netflix is just going to be a small, like, no one is going to do this, and then, you know, like, fast forward a few years and they're out completely.
Great.
All right, cheers, guys.
Cheers, folks. Awesome sponsorships. All right, completely changing gears. Category creation is great, and there's a lot of discussion about it. I think it's very interesting because many times it is kind of being forced on CMOs from the CEOs, on CEOs from the VCs, and the list goes on and on. But let's talk about something completely different. You both worked in startups for quite some time. Brian, I'll start with you. Let's think about, if you think about your biggest #fail moment where you cursed a lot, lost some sleep, and, you know, got over it afterwards. But one of the biggest fail moments where you just screwed up something by an action that you did, or just like a wrong conclusion. What
Personally, or company, or both?
I like both.
Yeah. I think so. The first one that comes to mind is like, was when I started at FlipKey as their first employee. I was 2 years out of college, but I started, you know, I think I signed a $10 an hour social contract, you know, like it was one of those types of roles, but I quickly like sort of found my sea legs. Anyway, the quick and short version is, as we started to add new people, I was like, I was a little bit like unwelcoming to like a new employee. And I didn't really know why. I think it was more because like there was like the core group of founders and early employees, and it was like this really tight knit group, and it was expanding, and people started to look different than me and act different than me, and I just wasn't as nice as I should have been, right? And I remember very vividly being taken to lunch by the CEO that day, and he said, you know, do you know what XYZ employee does? And I was like, no. He's like, well, that's your first problem. And he's like, you know, secondly, he described the role that employee was coming in to fill, and that I knew nothing about anything that person was doing. And I didn't even know why it was so important to the business. But the point, you know, the lesson that I learned, right, was like, it's just not about me. And, you know, don't judge things that you don't understand. And so I always, from that point on, sort of like, tried to like tried to like really understand what was going on. So that was like that was a personal lesson. I think in terms of like failing at business, the list of those goes on and on and on and on. I think it's the personal stuff that you learn. And that was an early lesson. I mean, that was 16 years ago now. And it's still, I can remember the moment. I can remember where I was sitting like it was yesterday.
That lunch with that CEO, that's so interesting. You brought it up. There could be all kinds of answers to this one, but you brought up something that I think most CEOs and most companies struggle with. You have this tight-knit group that you were mentioning that went through, highs and lows, kind of went through battles, like, so you bonded on the adversity. Excuse my language ahead of time, who the fuck is this person coming in and like coming into this group? They don't know what we've been through. And so sometimes it creates this, kind of divider, and you almost want to put them through a grilling process to just see that they can go through what you went through. I don't know if that's something similar to what you refer to, but it's interesting that first of all, the CEO was humble enough to, have that conversation with you and ask the question versus just apply judgment right away. And then two, you remember that 16 years back. So maybe you can react to that a little bit and maybe even give an example of who that person was and how you reacted actually.
Yeah, the new employee or the CEO?
The new employee, and both.
Yeah, I mean, so the new employee was a quality assurance engineer, right? And like I didn't know what a QA engineer did at the time. I think, and they didn't do anything incorrect. Like they weren't even, you know what I mean? It was just to your earlier point. It was this idea of like, well, we built what's here. And now, and I think, Macario, you can probably attest to this, right? Having been at these startups for such a long period of time. Now, here I am 15 years later, having gone from 0 to 7 years with that company and then starting over and doing another 7 years. And you quickly realize like, this is just part of how this thing works, right? And so, it becomes very obvious. But I think the other lesson there is just like when you're young, you just don't understand. There's so much that you don't understand that only experience can teach. And that's why I think, podcasts like this and just, even with our new business, a lot of what we talk about is inspiring the next generation. And so the ability to learn from the people who have already fucked these things up, right? So that you don't fuck them up is, I think it's a powerful thing.
Yeah. I had a similar experience actually. And it's funny you say that, Gil, because I'll go back at Jasper as an example. I mean, we went through torture, right? And there was this core group and we became very, very tight, right? And to this day, I mean, these are my brothers and sisters and I love them dearly. And I haven't worked with them in several years now, but it's like, it's just that kind of bond. And we actually churned out a lot of new people that we would try to bring in to make our team stronger. And it took a while, but people would give us feedback just saying, do you guys know how hard you are on new people? You know how hard like it is to break into your group? But we're the leaders of the business, right? It's just like the executive team. It's like the executive team shouldn't be that way, right? And it took a while for us to sort of like say, we got to stop being this way. And a lot of it was like, part of it is, yes, we've been through hell together. A lot of it is, are you as smart as we are? Are you as good as we are? Like we're going to put you to the test to make sure you belong, right? To the point you were making earlier, Gil. And we churned out good people as a result because they're just like they could never break through. And now I look back on it, and it was the bad thing to do. We were actually hurting the business as a result of that. I love the bond, and I love the familial aspect of all of what we did together, but we really did hurt the business by not being more open and giving these newer folks a chance to really shine. And maybe we could be operating differently. And we never really thought that way, I think, collectively as a group. So it was a really key learning lesson.
Love that. I myself went through this learning a couple of years ago. I remember being in an interview and seeing how one of the person was just treating the interview, and I was like, shit, this is painful. This is not good at all. And but of course, it's like the balance between respecting and honoring what you've gone through also, and understanding that the business is growing. It's part of the business, it's part of the deal. And you have to be cool about new people coming, different people who haven't gone through the same thing. Very interesting. What is your own hashtag fail moment that you want to share?
Oh gosh, I'll just to kind of talk a little bit about youth, right? I came out of college in the late 90s or the dot-com boom. So I'm a little old now. And of course, at that time, everybody was going to be a multimillionaire. Everybody was brilliant. I mean, the amount of money you see in tech today is pretty damn high. It was even like worse back then, right? And so I quit after 2000, in sort of middle 2000. I quit my dot-com job. I was working for Lycos. I got acquired into Lycos, for any people who are old enough to remember that as an actual search engine. And I said, I'm going to go be an entrepreneur and I'm going to go raise millions of dollars. And I could do this because anybody can do this, and I'm going to be a gazillionaire. And I was so freaking naive, man. I had no idea how to solve a problem, how to source a problem. I didn't put in the time or the effort to really understand what it takes to walk in the shoes of the people you're trying to solve for. And I would go out and just make shit up and try and do like VC pitches. And to their credit, they at least saw through my BS, and I never got funded. But they actually said, "Oh, don't worry, you'll get funded. Somebody will give you cash." I was like, which is insane. So this was now sort of it was the beginning of the dot-com crash. So thankfully, I ended up spending 8 months of basically screwing around. And it wasn't a colossal failure, but it was a slap in the face to me later to say, dude, there's no skating past this. You have to actually do the work. You have to like put in the time. There's a level of effort that goes above and beyond being an employee if you actually want to be an entrepreneur or work for yourself. And I'm not an entrepreneur, right? And I have great admiration. I work for them, and I know what I'm good at, what I'm not good at. And but it took that period of time, and thankfully I learned that lesson early in life. But there's no free skating on this one. It was tough.
I love that. I think many people will God bless you for what you said. I think that's a great insight. The entrepreneur, no, it doesn't matter. I think you're probably right there and there in the battle together with the entrepreneur with that with that point of view. So we talked about the hashtag fail moment. Thank you for that. Very insightful. Let's talk about a different one. What is you worked for startups for a while, Macario, and Bryan, you as well. What is a piece, like a kind of a, I don't know, misconception, something that is constantly being talked about, constantly being promoted by VentureBeat and TechCrunch and Business Insider and all those publications, that every time you read, you're like, fuck this shit. This is bullshit. Every time I've been through a startup, it has been completely different. It's a wrong thing to teach to people who are about to come into this journey. Excuse my language again. Like, what do you think? There's one that you personally feel very strongly about that is what seems to be a truth that is absolute bullshit, like completely untruth that you've experienced. Bryan, I see you thinking. Macario, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. I mean, having my first reaction when you were asking the question was, what's the thing that you see that's absolute bullshit? And I say AI, but 5 years ago it would have been cloud, and it's like whatever the hype is. And but actually thinking about more of just the world of startups and having worked in one, and what's the reality. The thing that I think most people don't quite realize is how hands-on you have to be in understanding the problem that you're solving. And so, whenever somebody quotes me a TAM, or whenever somebody quotes me an analyst report from Gartner, it's like, these people don't understand. There's lies, there's damn lies, there's statistics, and there's TAM. Like, it has nothing to do with the reality. Like, it's, and then you could only really, to me, where I've seen success is when you so deeply understand the customer's environment more than they understand it, and you have a level of insight that no other vendor has. That's when you can actually deliver unique value. That's when you have something that's truly unique that can sustain. And the press never covers that. If it's mentioned in an analyst report, it's too late. Everybody already knows it, right? And so I guess it's just the superficiality of understanding what problem you're actually solving, and the reality of the buyer, or reality of the customer. It can only be bottoms up. It can never, ever be top down in terms of how you learn it. That's been my experience.
I love that. I think that sentence you said, if it's already like in an article where you read it and it's like an obvious trend or an obvious problem, it's already too late because then everyone else knows about it. Wonderful. Bryan.
Yeah, I don't know that I read a lot of the publications that you're referring to.
What publications do you read that you thought are relevant to startups before you started?
No, oh, I mean, relevant to startups. I mean, from the bookshelf behind, there's a lot of Jim Collins. There's a lot of, I've seen you mention Think Bigger, a lot of startup business books. I think, when I think about like startup press, so like what immediately came to mind to Macario's point when you were asking the question is like, I often feel like all the news that I see are fundraising announcements and success stories, when the reality of 7 years in a startup is like, you're slogging through it, right? And I think those, you can read a drizzly outcome story with Uber or a Flipkey TripAdvisor story, and it seems great. But like when you really go back through the steps in the process to get there, it always seems at the end like the path to get there was so clear. When the reality is the path is never really that clear. And it's, I always tell my teams like the highs are never as high as they are and the lows are never as low. It's this constant, just like trying to manage expectations, right? Like we raised a series A, like, well, let's not get too high. Like we're about to run out of money. Well, let's not get too concerned. And it's this constant flow. So I think, I just think unless you've lived it and you've been in it and you've woken up in the middle of the night, thinking about those things, it's really hard to describe in an article. And it just seems to be celebrated an awfully lot more than I remember celebrating along the way. Now, don't get me wrong. I go back to Macario with something you said, which is just like the people that you go through these things with, they're like more than coworkers, right? They're the best friends that you'll ever have for the rest of your life. So it's all worth it. And I'm not saying that it's not, but it always seems like it's also glamorous. And I just I don't think that's really true.
Don't get too enamored with the overnight success stories.
Yeah, or the foosball and the beer, and it's like it's you got to come in and get the job done. Figure out the problem. I think figure out the problems you're trying to solve, and then understand that the problem you're trying to solve is going to change because you might not have it exactly right, and so yeah.
The amount of stuff that gets noticed or discussed or reported on that doesn't matter is massive. Like the foosball stuff doesn't matter. Frankly, reporting that you raised money's fuel. You need fuel, but that's not a result, right? That's it's just fuel but it's not a result. There's high five for the day that you got some fuel, but that's it. You still got to drive somewhere. Totally agree with everything Bryan just said.
Love that. Fuel is great, but you still have to drive somewhere. That's very interesting. Many times the industry, the investors maybe will almost create that false sense of accomplishment for raising that round or that high valuation, while in fact you're still at like, $0 ARR or your churn is like at 60s. And you just don't know because no one told you that. And even if they told you, you thought, oh, this is the outlier. This guy is just like, this underdog. This is not the reality. Like, this is what's important. And you don't hear it. Sometimes, I have this, I told my wife, having this podcast started as a category creation, ended up being like my therapy sessions where I'm just like talking to founders and they just, validate some of the shit and the greatness that we go through. And not everyone understands this is part of the life. Doesn't matter founder or not. Like you're in there in the battle, you're there in the times where your runway is very short, or you can't raise the round, or whatever you went through. And these people have been with you in that moment. And the TechCrunch reporter only talk to you after you already accomplished, that next stage.
They're trying to get the clicks. Yeah.
If you had there are a few more things that we can accomplish. First of all, let's accomplish one more cheer. Thank you, Macario. You're already on it.
I'm on it.
You are on it.
Fill it up, so I did.
Very pleased with the amount of alcohol consumed. Thank you. If you think about yourself 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you want to really go, long back. What is the one piece of advice that you think is the most important? Maybe intimate, but by far the most important piece of advice that you really wish someone told you, and there's a chance also that you'll consume it, because there's all kinds of piece of advice that unless you go through something, you're just gonna reject it. It's like, nah, it's a cliche, it's bullshit. I'm not. Let's just wait until I really incorporate that one. But a piece of advice that someone who listens now will say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Even from my point of view, I don't have those guys' 15 years experience. I still think it makes sense, and I'm gonna think about this.
Yeah.
Macario or Bryan, please.
I got one.
Go ahead, Bryan. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, and I still am trying to do this. I think there's someone on my team this week that will know that I still am not always living to it. But I remember reading a quote. Matt Sundin, he was the captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he talked about true leadership basically being like making sure that your worst day is better than most people's best day. So like just not, we all wake up and feel like shit, or aren't into it, right? Or are frustrated. And that's not even to mention like everybody's also dealing with something that you don't know about, which is like another piece of advice. So there's kind of two, like you got to limit the downside, but then it's also like, and I've had my own personal shit that I've been dealing with. And then someone's coming at me at work and I'm thinking like, if you only knew what I was dealing with outside, you wouldn't come at me that way. So it's trying to put that back. But again, I think as a leader, whether it's a founder, an executive, or just a manager, like not having the really bad days, right? Having your bad days be better than most people's good days is like a really great thing to strive for. I think it's maybe unachievable. For me, it's unachievable, but it's a good like North Star goal.
What's the questions you ask yourself when you try to achieve that goal?
Like, again, I think it's like if you just think everybody's gotten to the end of a day and they were like, that was a good day, right? And then like when you get to the end of a day and it's a bad day, it's usually not because you like didn't work hard, right? Like, and I'll use the example and like this week, it's like I just was really frustrated and overtly frustrated on a Zoom. Not a great trait for like a leader of an organization. I apologized to the employee and like it's just like it was like I fucked it up. And I got to the end of the day and I was like, was I as good as I could have been today? And I was like, no, that was really not good. I'm not going to harp on it anymore. It's like you realize it, you acknowledge it. If an apology is necessary, you make it and you move on. But it's like, I think it's that more than anything. Like, and I don't do it every day that I have a good day. Like most days are, usually like they're pretty good. But yeah, limiting the downside.
Limiting the downside. And it sounds like you can, at least in many times, separate the ego, climb down from the tree and say like, shit, sorry about that one. And you move on.
The best people that I've ever worked with, the best leaders that I've ever had, that's the way they operated. That's what I try to emulate, right? Because it's like, if there's just empathy and honesty, then it's really hard for people to get too frustrated. Like you can make mistakes, but if you have empathy and honesty and can admit them and like be self-critical about it, then it's like hard for people to be like, that guy's really an asshole. I was an asshole for a minute, but I'm not always an asshole, right?
That's great. Definitely a quote for LinkedIn. Macario.
There were two that kind of came to mind. My personal trait, and I think it's very similar to what Bryan had just said, was patience. It's never as high, it's never as low. And, there would be times where, somebody would be acting a certain way and I'd wake up at 4 a.m. and my mind would race on and churn and churn and churn and churn. And back then I'd try and I would always try to attack something like immediately. And I realized that if you just let it rest, you get a little patience, it's never as bad. It also is never quite as good, but it's never as bad as you think it is. And so patience, I think, was a key learning trait for me. But the item the second item, which I think is a little bit more sort of company oriented, at any given point in time, in my opinion, in the life of a smaller business, at any given point in time, there's typically one or two things that really, really matter. I mean, like game changer matter. And there's a lot of things that can keep you busy that are urgent, but and it's so easy to fill your day with all those other items because those big one or two big things are so big, but like they're the difference between, you know, one massive deal could be a game changer, right? It's a $100 million valuation to $1 billion valuation. It's like setting yourself up for an IPO, like those kinds of things. At any given point in time, I think there's one or two things that really, really matter. It's hard to identify them, and it's even harder to say, I want to be laser focused. And all these people tell me I got to do all these other things, but I'm going to shut them out. And they're going to be pissed. They don't quite understand why, because it's important to them, but you got to be laser focused on the things that matter. That's hard, but I found that has been sort of a successful rule in my experience.
I want to follow up on that. You know, sometimes I remember having a meeting with two of my VPs, and we used to talk, you know, every week. We still talk every week, and I remember in one of the meetings we started talking about stuff, and I was like, stop. Like, I'm sure there's a list of stuff you want to talk about. I am fairly certain there is one big thing you really want to talk about. And I told them, look, let's say you have 10 things to talk about. There's one thing you're extremely uncomfortable and that you want to leave to the end because you're really worried about what I'm going to say or what's going to be the result. Let's set that one as the first one. Even if we talk about it for 29 minutes, that's going to be the one. And that, you know, 1 week later and the next few years until today, they would bring up the thing that they're most worried, the most problematic, the most uncomfortable to talk about, because that's where the money is, right? That's where the gold is. How do you, first of all, do you agree, other than, you know, I'm setting up for success because I see you both nodding, but two, like, how do you get the people to do it yourself and your team to actually do it, because it's not easy to follow up on what you said?
I'll let Macario answer because I think I'm interested in what he has to say. I'll piggyback on one thing he said though, which is like sometimes it's hard to identify. So I think even in my new business, which is so new, we have 7 full-time employees and a bunch of fantastic interns that help us, but you can only do so much with that many people. And we have a lot of things that we think are important. I think we're even now trying to figure out what is the thing, right? Which is sometimes a hard thing as well. So like, I have 29 minutes to spend out of 30. What is the thing I spend it on? And so even identifying it, I think at an early stage can be a challenge. But Macario, I'll let you kind of handle that.
It's very, very hard. It's very hard. And I think that's kind of the burden of the CEO, right? Is to be able to provide that degree of leadership. And you know, if you step back and say, you know, just think about your business and you think about you're talking to somebody who's not involved in your day to day. And, you know, they ask you the question, well, what do you need and what could you do right now to turn this to a 10x business, 5x business, 2x business? And if you sit back and you reflect on that, something will tend to emerge. It may not be the final thing, but it's kind of the line of thinking to help sort of guide towards that. There may be other things that get in the way of that. I'm having a series of outages. We're having a huge scale problem. It doesn't really matter what my 10x growth is. My house is on fire, right? The number one thing is put out the fire. Like, so it changes. It's not always growth related. I'm using growth as an example. But, you know, if you start thinking that way, and it is really hard, man. There's no secret magic. I don't know. Like it's just good leadership. If you can identify it and then you just keep people focused, keep yourself focused. I have trouble focusing on the one thing. And then, you know, I just espouse this as an idea and say, we all should do this, but it's freaking hard, man. Cause it's just easy to knock off all the other stuff that's kind of happening throughout the day. So I don't have any magic advice outside of to say it's, if you really step back and separate yourself from the day-to-day business and you look to elsewhere, pretend you're talking to your wife, an investor, whomever, a mentor, and you ask yourself that question, what would the answer be? And chances are you would kind of know, because if you at a stage of the business, you would essentially start to understand the business well enough, you kind of know the things that start to make a real difference.
Very interesting. You know, I do have you're mentioning a mentor. I have a coach, Mark Organ. He's the founder of Eloqua, and many times he tells me, like, you know, like, this is a good time for you to step out of, you know, zoom out of the business from the operational part and think about, you know, how to operate on the business, like not within the business, but outside. You know, everyone has their things. Some people do smoke some weed, some people do some shrooms, some people, whatever, they do good, some Vipassana, but do it. It's cool. Like, take it to pause and think about a business in ways that you don't usually allow yourself to, because it's crucial. Otherwise, you'll keep maintaining the small details. Super interesting. Hey, we're 1 minute ahead. If there's one thing you want to leave our audience with, our listeners with, before you finish, what would that be? Macario, you first. Anything.
Yeah, I mean, in the world of business, especially in startups, intimately know your customers better than they know themselves. That will never steer you wrong, right? Just get to know them, put in the time, put in the effort.
Love that. Bryan?
I think I would just, I don't know the exact demographics of your audience, but I would just say, like, go for it. Like for people that are thinking about getting involved in startups, or people that are thinking about starting their own companies. Like, I just think my whole life, my parents and everything else, I was sort of encouraged to like take those shots, calculated risks, but like do the work to figure out that it's a shot you want to take, and then take it. And the worst thing that can happen is it doesn't work out and you move on. And I think a lot of people, whether it's moving to a new destination or starting a business, they get caught up in that.
Super cool. Very fortunate. The great parents. Awesome. Well, with that, I'm gonna finish this episode. Bryan and Macario, I really fucking enjoyed. Excuse me, I keep saying and keep cursing, but I really enjoyed this this podcast episode. I really enjoyed both of your candor and all of the insights. So thank you. I really appreciate it, legitimately. And yeah, that's it.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks,
Gail. Very
guys.
nice speech, Bryan.
Yeah. Cheers.
Take care.
Thanks again for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed today's discussion and will tune in again. Find all of the B2B Category Creators episodes at Metadata.io. And if you have any feedback, topics, or would like to be a guest on the show, please reach out.